Good afternoon. So Charles Nord, I'm head of product for the sustainability tool, which is a software for reporting and managing sustainability performance. That product is owned and run by Action Sustainability, the organization that founded and operates the Supply Chain Sustainability School. Today, we've got an hour lunch and learn session on measuring and managing sustainability performance, with a special focus today on carbon. So the objectives essentially are to look at the effective mechanisms and measures that we can put in place for managing sustainability performance from a broad perspective, and then we'll focus in on some specifics for carbon. I'd like to start off by just going through how you should define your objectives. Essentially, the thought process behind that is you shouldn't be reporting or trying to manage sustainability objectives if you don't have a sort of a wider strategy that runs behind that. Two, we'll look at a standardized process that we've implemented with many clients across construction, infrastructure, and facilities management, and hopefully we can sort of give you that framework that you could copy as a template for your own organizations. And then finally, we'll focus on carbon, as I said, and go through some specifics of carbon reporting and putting carbon strategies, carbon reduction strategies together. Just a few house rules before we go into the content. So today we've got an hour in total, so until 1 p.m. UK time. In Zoom, this is a lunch and learn session, so it's not a workshop. There's not much interaction, but if you do have questions, please use the Q&A, the question and answer panel. Those come to us, and we'll try and answer them as we go along or when we see fit. At the end of the session, we will share a link for you to provide feedback. So that's really important. If you can complete that helps us to improve and to deliver better training sessions. We will share the slides that I'm presenting today. And finally, the session is being recorded as well and will be uploaded to the Supply Chain Sustainability School resource library so that you can refer to it in the future. So want to jump straight in because the agenda is tight today. So we want to first of all look at defining objectives, and I know today's session we are focusing on carbon, but one key thing to understand is that if you want to be managing your sustainability impacts and therefore reporting sustainability data, and that needs to sort of come from a wider sustainability strategy. Too often we're seeing organizations who jump straight in and say, oh well, we want to sort of reduce our carbon emissions, or we need to measure waste, etc. And it seems like they're trying to sort of do disparate activities with no consolidated sort of strategy that sits behind it, and far too often that sort of is setting yourself up for failure. So what we recommend is that organizations start off by looking at defining sustainability for their organization. And here I'm just presenting sort of a few frameworks that can help you to understand what does sustainability mean for your organization. By defining sustainability, you're then going to be able to set strategic objectives, and then therefore determine, well, what do we need to be managing from a sustainability perspective? And when I mean managing, it means recording your impact, trying to measure your impact and taking action on the back of that, right? That's the end goal of performance management. So if you start off by defining sustainability, we've got sort of very wide definitions of sustainability that you can use as frameworks. So first of all, on the left-hand side there, I'm showing the sort of triple bottom line, or the social, economic, and environmental definition of sustainability, whereby you try to think of the various impacts that your organization has against society, on the environment, and on the economy. Okay, and obviously there's overlaps. That's what those three circles are trying to show. And very simply, you could sort of start to think, well, what are we seeking to do as an organization within that? A more evolved, I guess, version of that is falls under the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So those are 17 sort of goals that the UN has developed. They're to be achieved by 2030. Under each of those sit sort of more specific actions that need to be taken. And organizations very often nowadays are sort of going through those and understanding, well, what's more material to them? Where do they think they can have impact? And therefore, what goals do they want to focus on? And that helps to sort of drive their sustainability strategy and objectives. Finally, I've provided sort of another example. These frameworks are definitely not exhaustive. There are lots and lots of examples that you can find in the market by doing some basic research. The final one is the One Planet Living Foundation, and essentially that defines sustainability within 10 different key strategy areas, and organizations are invited to look at each sort of sustainability area and define, well, where do they think they should be focusing their sustainability efforts, right? And they would pick a few of the areas, just like for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you might pick a few goals that you think this is what we're really going to work on, and all our sustainability work will sort of fall under one of these pillars. So the mechanism to sort of get to that definition is essentially quite simple. We sort of talk about heat mapping, and really the recommendation is that you bring together a group of stakeholders. So that might be obviously your internal teams, your colleagues. It would be some of your clients as well, and then other stakeholders that you might have, such as investors or your local community, your suppliers as well. Ideally, you bring all those individuals together, bring those parties together, and try to define, well, where do we have the most impact currently? Where do we think we can have the most impact? Where can we create the most change, etc.? Look at different sort of impact areas, and based on that, you use that to inform sustainability strategy. You've got to recognize, of course, that you can't do everything as an organization. You can't solve all the sustainability issues of the world. So you want to focus in on the ones that make most sense for you, and where you can have the most change. Here's an example from British Land, which I think is a really good example. You can go online to their website and download their strategy. You can also look at, from a reporting performance management point of view, all the data points that they're collecting to measure this strategy and to track where they're improving, where they need to improve. But essentially, they sort of create their own narrative around sustainability based on their organization and you know what sustainability means for them. They sort of start off by saying, well, we want to be net zero carbon. We want to demonstrate environmental leadership, be a place-based approach, and advocate responsible business. Now that's one way of them defining that, and then under that sit 3 UN Sustainable Development Goals that they've sort of publicly committed to achieving and focusing on. So all their work is sort of underpinned by those 3 goals. All their sustainability objectives are. So here, just really sort of quite briefly, the key thing to remember is you want to have a strategy before you jump into reporting and performance management. That strategy needs to be unique to yours, needs to reflect your organization and what you do. And But then finally, you also want to recognize that you can't address issues in silos. You can't just address carbon and then forget about social value, for example. You've got to think about the interconnectedness between all of those issues. Okay, so I know we're going to be focusing on carbon today, but I want you to recall that sustainability is broader than just carbon, and often there's an interrelation between all of those issues. And finally, I just wanted to at this stage also pick up on a point around what do we mean by sustainable, and there are what we're seeing is sort of two different or two key aspects of your organization that can be sustainable. It can be you as an organization. You can have, sustainable policies and operate sustainably, but also there can be a difference in terms of how sustainable your products and services are. Okay, so by that, if we look at an organization that employs lots of apprentices or people from disadvantaged backgrounds, etc., that as an organization is acting sustainably, right, under those criteria. Developing, let's say you manufacture a product from recycled materials and it's got low carbon, etc., that is a low carbon product or service that you're providing. And often organizations sort of want to disassociate both of them and just try to understand, are we as an organization sustainable, or are products and services sustainable? When you look at procurement as well, it's the same thing. Do we want to buy from organizations that are sustainable, or is it the products and services that are sustainable that matter to us? Okay. So there we go. So I was just checking if there are any questions, but it seems like there are none so far. So with that in mind, and with a strategy in place that clearly defines what you want to be focusing on as an organization, you can then start to think of, well, how do we performance manage? And performance management is essentially about collecting data and using that to track whether you're on the path to hitting your targets, your objectives or not, and taking action on the back of that information. Okay. This is why it's very important to start off with your strategy, because if you don't start off with a strategy, you're going to be collecting data and you're not really going to know what you're going to do with it at the end and what you're going to be measuring. So please start off with your strategy and go down. We'll go through a couple of examples of how that can apply. So the performance management process, essentially it starts off with planning. So planning is around, as I've mentioned before, developing your strategy. Once you've got a strategy in place, you can then start defining or identifying KPIs. So the KPIs are key performance indicators, and they're the measures that you're going to use as an organization to see, are we achieving our strategy or not? If in our strategy, we've got an objective to become, to reduce our impact on climate change, or our contribution to climate change, then one of our KPIs might be how many tons of carbon are we emitting per £1 million of turnover, for example. And you might put targets against that, right? So that once you measure it, you know, are we achieving those targets or not, right? Those are the KPIs. You also need to think about the processes and tools that need to be put in place, right? What mechanisms do we need as an organization to be able to collect information, analyze it, take action on the back of it, report, you know, in terms of our progress and so on. And then you've got to think as well of which fits into the point after, of roles and responsibilities. Who are our stakeholders? So who is going to be involved in this process? Is it just our internal colleagues? Is it people on site? Is it some of our subcontractors and suppliers, and so on and so forth? And that will help determine what processes and tools you need as well, right? So if you're looking to go outside of your organization, then and collect data from your supply chain, for example, or from your customers, then you will need to put different tools and processes in place for that. Finally, in the planning phase, you also want to think about the frequency. So how often do we want to be measuring and reviewing all of this? My recommendation with all our clients is to try and be as frequent as possible. Most of the clients that I work with report data on a monthly basis, and that gives them granularity so that they're able to track sort of actions and what implications that have, or what consequences those actions have on reducing their carbon emissions, for example. And they can, if they're doing that on a monthly basis, they can sort of see the immediate cause and effect, as opposed to, you know, doing a performance management exercise once every year. That gives you less opportunity to act. If we think of a construction project, for example, there was a trend, and I think that's changing now. There was a trend to report the impact of a project at the end of a project, right? So you'll go on a project, you'll commit to having zero waste going to landfill. You might collect some information along the way that will help you to analyze that. You analyze it at the end of a project and report that back to your client. Then you can say, well, actually, we didn't hit our target of having zero waste going to landfill. We had 10% of waste that went to landfill. We'll try better next time, right? That can happen if you're reporting and analyzing the data at the end of a project. That's why you'd like to that's why you want to report on a monthly basis, as an example, right? But at least more frequently, so that you can know at any point, is all our waste going to landfill or not? Are we hitting that target? If we're not, let's try and make sure that we implement policies or new procedures in place on that project to make sure that we're achieving the desired objective. So once you've done your planning, and we'll go a little bit more in the planning afterwards, what you then want to do is obviously collect. All right, so collect in performance management means collect the data, right? Collect data that's going to inform, are we achieving our strategy or not, right? This is about doing sort of sustainability without the guff, right? It's about really using data and information to drive your decision making. So once you've collected data, you do the checking. Essentially, that's analyzing the information. You can use some systems. So the system that I run helps to do that automatically. So you just collect the data, and it tells you where you're doing well, what you're doing well, what you're not doing well, and then you use that to report to your stakeholders, which leads you into the final sort of key piece of action here, which is acting. And acting is around using the data or the analysis to influence decisions and then implementing those decisions. And then, like any plan, do, check, act model, what you want to do is regularly sort of reviewing all of this, right? Every time you go through a cycle, you sort of review, do we need to change anything in our planning, in our data collection, in our analyzing, and then in how we implement actions.
Hi, Charles. We've just got a question from Cherry in the Q&A section. So this is sustainable versus sustainable. How have you seen this managed? Do you see strategies develop in silo to deal with the viewpoint of the organization sustainability versus the product sustainability?
Thank you very much, Aya, and thank you, Cherry, for that question. It is. There can be a tendency to sort of develop those strategies in silo, but they shouldn't be. I think that concretely, it comes down to sort of the context of what you're looking at, and I think I can exemplify that by looking at sort of procurement, for example. You want to think what is the most important here, right? What is most important? Is it that our product or service that we're purchasing, for example, is sustainable, or is it the organization that we're dealing with that needs to be sustainable? With carbon, it is a great example of that. Carbon, as we all know, is a global issue, right? Whether you emit a ton of carbon here in the UK or whether it's Bangladesh or wherever around the world, it doesn't matter, right? Because the climate crisis and global warming is global by definition, right? And therefore, if you are, let's say, working with an organization that as a business has a massive carbon footprint, but the product and service that you're purchasing from them is zero carbon, let's say, net zero, then you know, you've got to think as an organization, what matters here? Does it matter that we're purchasing a low carbon solution, or is what really matters that the organizations that we deal with, we know that they're also reducing their carbon emissions overall, right? And it doesn't really matter what we're doing because that's sort of discrete in a way. What really matters is that we're seeing that, you know, everyone that we engage in business is also working to reduce their carbon emissions. So I you know, it's a balancing act. If you're that organization, obviously you want to be a sustainable organization providing sustainable products and services. You could run the risk of sort of being seen to greenwash if you're providing, you know, low carbon solutions, but actually, you know, overall your business is not operating that sustainably, you know, and you along the side offer you know, unsustainable products and services, if that makes sense. So I would say it needs to go hand in hand. And when you're developing KPIs, you know, for your sustainability strategy or for the sustainability performance management of your supply chain, for example, just try and consider that every single KPI and think, does this need here? Does it matter that what we're purchasing is sort of seen as sustainable, or that the organization we're working with? If I go back to the example of apprentices, I've got clients who say, right, you know, as part of sort of the tender process, they'll say, right, well, you know, we want to know that you're hiring an apprentice and that you know, that apprentice is working on our project, which is, you know, which it can make sense sometimes, but actually what they want to know is that we are an organization with a strategy and with policies in place that provide opportunities to apprentices. It doesn't really matter that the apprentices work or not on their specific project, as long as we as an organization are giving those opportunities to people in our local area. So that's where you know, that's where you sort of can view the difference and try to assess, you know, contextually, does it make sense here that we're looking at a sustainable organization for this KPI, or does the specific product that they're providing need to be sustainable, right? I hope that answers your question, Cherry. So picking back up on the slides here, this is sort of the after the strategy. This is the key sort of framework that we use, and essentially it tells organizations, you need to start off by defining your goals, right? So from your strategy, you define your goals. As an example, we want to reduce our impact on climate change. From that, you establish your targets. Often targets are, you know, got an absolute or a numerical value against them. So in this instance, we want to be net zero by 2025. Again, it's got a timestamp against it, so we know when we want to achieve this. It's quite concrete. From that, you develop indicators. So to be net zero by 2025, the indicator is, well, what are our tons of carbon emissions as an organization? Other types of indicators could be, as I said earlier on, our carbon emissions by £1 million of turnover, for example. That gives a normalization factor against it. It could also be, percentage of waste going to landfill or something, or number of apprentices, or those are the types of indicators. And then from that stem the metrics. What actual data do you need to collect to be able to measure the indicator, to see how you're doing against your target, which will inform whether you're achieving you're en route to achieving your goal or not. Okay, now the metrics, sometimes it's exactly like the indicators. So our objective could be, our target could be hire 5 apprentices. Our indicator is number of apprentices. The metric for data that we collect is number of apprentices. In the case of carbon, for example, it's often going to be underlying data that help to measure your carbon emissions, such as fuel consumption, electricity consumption, and so on and so forth. So that is essentially, if you remember one thing from today's session, I hope it'd be this slide. And what I would encourage you is to try and think of your sustainability strategy and go down and essentially complete a table where you can say, right, well, for each pillar of our sustainability strategy, how many goals do we have? And then within each goal, develop your targets, develop your indicators, and then develop your metrics. That last column, your metrics, is going to be the list of data points that you need to collect and measure. Now, of course, some of you might say, well, it's not just about our strategy, it's also about some reporting frameworks that we need to submit data against, but actually all of that comes into your strategy and into what you need to be focusing on. So this should almost be the sort of holy grail of your sustainability strategy, from my point of view, at least. When you establish that, a few things to remember: define your stakeholders, so understand who's going to be doing all of this, who's going to be doing the most important is the data collection piece, right? Writing down the metrics all the time. Based on that, you need to understand, well, do they have the tools and processes in place to do that? Do they know what we're asking? So using a common language is very important. Often in sustainability, we're using our own sort of jargon that's doesn't seem sort of relatable, or other people sort of struggle to know what we're referring to. So we've just got to be careful to use sort of plain language as much as possible. Exploring the resources and tools. I've mentioned that. When you're establishing your targets, you want to use sort of informed, smart targets and not sort of finger in the air type targets. So using baseline data, historic data, or industry averages sort of often helps to make sure that you're trying to achieve something that's realistic. And then finally, I mentioned that already, but the establishing reporting frequency is very important. So just a few pointers there to sort of remember when you're putting a performance management sort of framework in place. So I'm trying to hone in on carbon a little bit more. So obviously, please remember that you don't want to do carbon in silo. You don't just want to be looking at your carbon emissions, developing that. But it's sort of without thinking about all your other sustainability issues. But this is sort of key things that would go into a carbon reduction strategy. So first of all, it's understanding, once you've understanding your scope. So I'll go into scopes in a minute, but essentially understanding, well, how much carbon are we going to be measuring, and do we feel that we're sort of accountable for? Measuring, that's sort of data collection. Again, things like identifying hotspots, finally, once you've got that, you can reduce your carbon emissions. So that's taking actions. You can also offset residual carbon emissions. So anything that you're unable to reduce, you can offset through certified carbon credits, for example. And then obviously you want to report, so sort of disclose what you're doing. With carbon, there are sort of official methodologies and frameworks that you should be using and following for calculating your carbon emissions and reporting it. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is sort of the Bible that you need to be looking at, and there's actually a specific version from NCORD on construction carbon measurements. For infrastructure, there's carbon management framework past 2080, and then if you're looking at sort of the life cycles of products and services, then you should be looking at the PAS 2050 specification. When we look at carbon emissions, so if you, as an organization, you say, right, well, we want to reduce our contribution to the climate crisis. The next question is, well, what is our impact? What is our current contribution to that? And that will lead you to asking yourself, well, how do we define our boundary, right? Because if you think about carbon emissions, and I'll exemplify that in a couple of slides. There's obviously the carbon emissions that you emit directly as an organization, but all the products and services that you're purchasing have got carbon emissions associated with them. All the infrastructure that you use has got carbon emissions associated with that, and so on and so forth. So you sort of need to define a boundary that says, right, well, this is how we're going to limit our boundary of carbon emissions. There are sort of, according to Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there are 3 different approaches. One is an equity share approach, which I don't think will apply to many of you on this call. Equity share is essentially looking at how much equity do we have in these assets, for example, and what are their emissions, and we sort of apportion to ourselves, the amount of carbon emissions based on the percentage of equity that we own. Maybe for some of you, if you're working on JVs, for example, that would be applicable, right? So if you're in a JV and it's 50-50% split JV between 2 organizations, then you would, according to the equity share approach, you would be responsible for 50% of the JV's overall carbon emissions. The other approaches is are financial control and operational control. So essentially that's looking at, in practice, who has decision-making power over these, either financially or from an operational perspective. I think for most of you on this call, particularly if you're looking at your operational, your organization's carbon emissions, then you want to measure that using the operational control approach, right? And essentially that's recognizing, well, what we do, we have an operational sort of control over that, and therefore we feel accountable for our carbon emissions. So there's a question from Stuart, which is asking, how do we measure carbon in a simple way? So I'm gonna hopefully right now I'm sort of starting to explain the basics of how to measure carbon emissions, and I'm going to go through that a little bit more, so trying to build the blocks so that you understand how that is done. And I'll finish off with a free tool that you can use as a recommendation to measure your carbon emissions in a really simple way. So when we talk about carbon emissions, we're actually referring to all greenhouse gases, carbon being sort of the most prevalent one, the one that's referred to all the time. But generally when we talk about carbon, we're actually meaning 6 different types of greenhouse gases. Okay, so and so very often what you'll see is when you look at an organization reporting their carbon emissions, they'll have a CO2, right? Everyone's seen CO2, but then there'll be a little E at the end of it. That E stands for equivalent, which basically means we're referring to carbon here, but actually we've looked at all the greenhouse gases that we emit, right? And that's what you need to do when you're doing a carbon footprint. You're actually doing a greenhouse gas footprint. What's the amount of greenhouse gases that we're emitting? The next sort of jargon buster is around scopes. So some of you might have heard of scopes in carbon. Essentially, according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, we need to categorize our carbon emissions in 3 different scopes. Scope 1 is our direct emissions. So we have company vehicles, we drive them. There's petrol that's being burned, and out of the exhaust come out greenhouse gases. There are other things as well that come out, but there's greenhouse gases, right? Gases that contribute to global warming. You know, or we've got a factory, and in there we've got a furnace, and that is generating greenhouse gases. Those are all our direct emissions. It's what we physically as an organization are producing in terms of greenhouse gases. That's our scope 1. The next is scope 2. In scope 2 is all your indirect purchased electricity, steam, and heating and cooling. Okay, so essentially it's all the energy that you procure from National Grid, for example, from your energy providers, right, from your utility companies, and that is scope 2. Essentially, it's just recognizing that there's energy that you consume, but the carbon emissions, you're not directly emitting those, right? It's the energy company that's emitting those on your behalf. That's your scope 2. For every single organization that reports on carbon emissions, the minimum they must include is their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, right? That's the minimum in a carbon footprint. The next piece is quite complicated. It's for scope 3 emissions, and that's all your other indirect emissions. What do we mean by that? We mean that, as I said earlier on, if you use you purchase goods and services, those goods and services that you use have got carbon emissions associated with them. Therefore, you as an organization, through your activities, are also sort of generating indirectly greenhouse gases from those third-party providers, for example. Sorry, just seeing there's a question there around purchased electricity and gas scope 2. So all of that goes into scope 2. So your scope 3 is really lots of things, right? The products that you purchase, they've got embodied carbon. They've got embodied carbon that was generated when they were being manufactured. Then the shipping of those products. If you use, let's say, a contractor for your transport, where they're driving vehicles around, right? So that's generating carbon emissions, and so all of that goes into your scope 3. If you use an airplane, right? You take a commercial flight to go somewhere, that plane is generating carbon emissions, that goes in your scope 3, and so on and so forth. So when you start looking at scope 3, you can think, wow, this can be massive. This can go on and on and on and on, right? Because what about the suppliers of my suppliers? Am I responsible for that, etc.? So that's where you've got to think of your approaches that came back earlier on, your operational or financial control. So do you have control over your suppliers, for example? Probably not. So you might want to limit your carbon emissions just to your tier 1 suppliers, as an example. Finally, it's not about what's upstream, but it's also about what's downstream in scope 3. So you could feel responsibility for the carbon emissions that are generated by your clients as a result of what you're selling to them. Okay, so if you sell goods and services, you might think, well, we're going to be responsible for how they use those goods and services and the carbon emissions associated with our clients using those, right? And you might feel that it's relevant for you to include that in your scope 3. Again, it comes back to the approach that you decide to take, which should be determined also by your strategy, right? What's important? It's important for us that our clients, are able to operate sustainably, and therefore, if that's what you've determined in your strategy with your stakeholder group, then probably means that you should include the scope 3 emissions associated with your clients using your products and services, and so on. So that's what we mean when we talk about carbon emissions and a footprinting exercise. Carbon is actually representative of all greenhouse gases, and then scope 1 is your direct emissions, scope 2 is all your electricity and energy purchases, and then scope 3 is everything else. It's all your supply chain, it's your the emissions of your clients as well, from the products and services that you're selling to them, and so on, right? So everything that's indirectly emitted as a result of your organizations. And scope 1 and 2 are must have in your carbon footprinting exercise. Scope 3, you need to determine your boundaries. Just a few questions there that have come up, some really interesting questions. So first of all, are there any practical tools for measuring scope 3 emissions for employee commuting? So I don't know if there are sort of systems that help you to just collect what how your employees are commuting. And typically organizations will sort of ask for employees, how do you typically, how do you generally come into work, for example, and then from that they'll sort of apply proxies, right? So I might say someone says, well, I come in 4 days a week using bus, and then 1 day a week using my car, and you also need to collect the mileage. It'd be a 50-mile round trip, and then you can multiply that, and from that sort of calculate the carbon emissions. So I don't know if there are any specific tools for collecting scope 3 emissions for employee commuting. What I do recommend that you do is you collect data on your employee commutes, and then from that you'll be able to very easily calculate the carbon emissions associated with that. To calculate carbon emissions, we actually use these carbon conversion factors. Okay, so there are official, in the UK, DEFRA publishes every year a list of official carbon conversion factors. So they say, right, for anyone taking the train, for example, there are X amount of carbon emissions associated with every kilometer or mile of train travel. So you just need to calculate, to collect the data on how many miles, and then you times it by that official calculator that's publicly available, that official conversion factor. There's another question around, with so many of our staff still working from home, would we need to include their electricity usage? It's a good question. I haven't come across a company yet who said, well, we're responsible for the electricity usage of our staff. It is true that over the past year or so, organizations carbon footprint has gone down because there's less commuting, because there's less electricity usage in the office. I would say if that again is very contextual, right? It's going to depend on your organization. If you feel like there's a duty for you to that you're responsible for that, maybe you should include it in there. Quite simply, if you're paying for their electricity bill, or if you're contributing to part of their electricity bill, because they're now working from home, and that should definitely be included, right? Because you're sort of officially saying, well, we're contributing to that, we have financial control over it, right? So as an organization, we haven't done that. For example, we don't include our staff's sort of home electricity consumption over this past period. You've also got to think about, well, is this going to be, is this really material? Is this a massive proportion of our carbon emissions or not? If it's not, you don't need to worry about it so much. There's sort of a Pareto principle here of trying to focus on the hotspots and focus on what's really having an impact. Electricity usage for the laptops that your employees are using at home is going to be very minimal. So not that it's unimportant, but it's just there might be other things that you want to focus on collecting data. And I responded earlier on to gas supply and electricity supply, that all of that go into scope 2 if you purchase it. If we think about carbon emissions in your supply chain, what we can see in this graph is that it's showing how your suppliers, scope 1, 2, and 3, your suppliers' entire carbon emissions go into your scope 3, okay, and so on and so forth. So one organization's entire footprint is their client's scope 3, and so on. What we've developed with the Supply Chain Sustainability School is a really simple tool that helps organizations to measure their carbon emissions, right? Those large circles, 1, 2, and 3 in there. It's a free tool, by the way, that you can all use. And then suppliers can then apportion their carbon emissions to their client. So it goes into their client's scope 3 emissions based on turnover. So for example, if we've got client 0 there at the bottom, let's say they represent 50% of that first tier 1 organization's turnover, then that tier 1 organization will calculate their entire carbon footprint using our system, and then they will say, give 50% of that into tier 0 clients scope 3. Okay, so that's how you can look at your supply chain carbon emissions, and that's in practice how it works. So I see there's another question around a company that is a garbage collection services organization and have large tonnage throughout the year. I'm assuming tonnage of waste, but they don't produce that garbage. They don't produce the waste. So is there waste? Essentially, the question is, for a waste collection services organization, or a waste contractor, is the waste that they're actually transporting part of their carbon emissions? That's a good question. I wouldn't assume so, because you're not such responsible for that waste. It's more around the travel, for example, of that waste. If you're purchasing the waste, however, and then doing something with it, reusing it, or or selling it on, then it becomes actually a material that you purchase. So you should include sort of the carbon emissions associated with it. What you might want to do, though, as a waste collector is still calculate the emissions associated with the waste that you're managing, because then that can inform how you can help your clients reduce their carbon emissions associated with their waste, and what happens to the waste once they sort of hand it over to you. So there is some merit in calculating that. In terms of how you get data, there's really sort of different ways you can get it. The best scenario, of course, is you get the real data. We know exactly what our energy consumption was. We know exactly how many fuels of liters we consumed. We can use that, times it by the official conversion factors, carbon conversion factors, and get our tons of carbon emissions. The other thing is you can use proxy data. So you can say, right, well, lots of organizations look at their spend, for example, to know the carbon that's embedded in their supply chain. They look at their spend. They will then, from that sort of try and estimate the amount of, the quantity of products or services that they might have purchased. And then within that, they will create sort of proxies for, well, let's say every pound spent in catering services, for example, has, X amount of carbon emissions associated with it. So we'll just use it that way. The other way of doing it is doing, sample data, and you extrapolate it. So you say, well, we're gonna look at 10% of our activities. We're gonna sort of collect all the underlying data, measure the carbon emissions, do a carbon footprinting exercise for 10% of our activities, and then times that by 10 to get sort of an estimate of our overall footprint. So that's another approach as well that you can do. I've mentioned conversion factors, but just so you know, there's in the UK, you want to use the DEFRA conversion factors that has sort of, quite an extensive list of key activities. It can tell you different vehicle types, different fuel types, etc., and then the associated carbon emissions with that. For materials, you can access the BARF-ICE database that gives you conversion factors for, a ton of brick, a ton of cement, etc., and it goes into more detail, so you can go to those. I think I've got a question around, can I provide a link? We'll share that afterwards. Sorry, I didn't prepare the link, but I'll share those links afterwards, and we'll send them via email alongside with the slides, so you've got them. Here's just an example of, kilowatt hours of grid electricity. Currently equates to, 1 kilowatt hour generates 0.288 kilograms of CO2. 1 kilowatt hour of red diesel generates 0.316 kilograms of CO2, and so on. There you can see the difference of passenger kilometers by train, car, and plane. Quite clearly, it's better to take the train than anything else. Here, just looking at some key data around materials as well. So a ton of aggregate is 5 kilos of carbon emissions. A ton of concrete generates 100 kilos of CO2. A ton of bricks 210. A ton of plastic board 390 kilos of carbon emissions, and then 1 ton of steel 1,500 kilos of CO2. So you can see there the different materials and what standard conversion factors are applied. When you're working with, when you're purchasing materials, for example, your supplier might have what's known as an EPD, Environmental Product Declaration, and they would have done a study to know the exact carbon emissions associated with their product. Here, what we're looking at are averages, right, that you can use. But if you want to get more precise, one of your suppliers might have the specific data. They've undergone an analysis, and they could tell you, well, actually, our steel is more carbon efficient than that. So there's a question around, I think here it was around, is this for diesel cars or petrol cars? I'm sorry, I can't recall. I'm just using that as an example. In DEFRA, you will see you can have an average car, or you can have petrol car, diesel car, electric car, etc., and then car types as well. So you can say a small car, a large car, a medium car, etc. Same applies for vans and heavy goods vehicles, etc. So you really can go in granularity. For the sake of simplicity, I just use car there as an example. Just to I think that would be average car. If I've done my work correctly, I would have used the average car factor. And then there's a question around how much interaction with occupants or stakeholders is required when gathering and extrapolating data. That's very contextual, but of course, very often you want to go beyond just your scope 1 and 2, and therefore, there's lots of people that you need to collect data from. We talked about waste. You might need to collect data from your employees for their commuting. You might need to collect data from your suppliers for the amount of materials that they sell to you, and so on and so forth. So really it can be quite an extensive exercise. And I think this links in well to the further resources, because the carbon tool that we provide sort of helps you to get sort of a baseline of your carbon emissions with sort of the must-haves in that. If you sign up to the carbon tool for free, you get a reporting interface that tells you what data you should be collecting to get sort of a basic carbon footprinting exercise. Now you might say, well, I've got other things that generate carbon emissions, but you can integrate those at a later date. Start off with the basics. Essentially your fuel consumption, your electricity consumption, and then some key sort of material data. I would suspect for most people in our industry is where the bulk of their emissions will be. We're coming up to the hour. I really recommend you to go to the Supply Chain Sustainability School Climate Action Group page and see all the exercises or activities that we're doing there. On that page, you will find a list of key e-learning and resources on carbon emissions, which help you to measure, but also to reduce your carbon emissions. We provide other workshops as well around that, so look out for those. And then, as I've mentioned, and we'll provide a link, we've got a carbon tool. We'll provide a link in the email that helps you as organizations measure your carbon emissions, and then apportion that based on percentage of turnover to your various clients. So you can say, well, these are, the system will help you to calculate, these are organizations' carbon footprint. And we did 20% of our work last month for BAM Nuttall, for example. So we're going to apportion 20% of our carbon emissions to them. Comes back to that graph, that graphic I was showing with, your scope 1, 2, and 3 is BAM Nuttall's, for example, scope 3 emissions as an example, right? So there you go. The key sort of features of that system is that it's free. It allows that apportionment piece that I talked about. If you already know your carbon emissions, you can just enter the amount. If you don't know them, the system will help you calculate. It will tell you what data you need to be collecting. It enables you to decide the frequency of reporting, whether you want to report monthly, quarterly, or annually. I would recommend that you do it at least quarterly, if not monthly. And then the system also gives you sort of dashboards where you can see carbon emissions by scope, as I was referring to, but also by type. So you can see your carbon emissions by materials, by transport, etc. So that helps you to see how it progresses over time, whether we're going up or down, and it helps you to identify your hotspots and where you might want to take action. So there we go. If you want more learning on performance management, we've got a dedicated page, and this is a link where you can find sort of a list of example KPIs for measuring sustainability impact across your business. We're going to follow up with the survey, so you get the feedback, so you can tell us what we need to improve on this session. And thank you very much for your time. These are my contact details if you'd like to get in touch, and if you've got any further questions. So I think we're just on time. Thank you to all. I hope I've answered the questions as I went along. I see I is sending a few links in the chat right now. We'll follow up via email. Thank you.